Good morning, folks. Welcome back to the Philosophy for Philistines channel, also known as Politics for Plebeians, with your host, this guy, Bill Reimer. I wanted to do a follow-up on yesterday's podcast, which was created about that critical theory being taught at York. It was difficult reading, and I know many of you found it difficult to hear what is actually occurring in the lecture halls of our universities, all covered by our tax dollars. So I wanted to develop the theme of why we are failing our children. So I begin. Why I believe we have abandoned our children and our sacred duty to them by allowing them to become wards of the postmodern state. And a quote from George Orwell. All tyrannies are ruled through fraud and force. But once the fraud is exposed, they must rely exclusively on force, which is why we see with Justin Trudeau's government it becoming increasingly intolerant and authoritarian. Facts simply do not matter to postmodernists and its bastard cousin, the cultural Marxists, since they're only dedicated to promoting a narrative which furthers their cultural revolution. Which is why any attempt to demonstrate their ideology is based upon obvious untruths will result in narcissistic projection, denial, and rage. Look at the narcissistic projection behind the pillorying, and vilifying of such notable academics as Dr. Gad Saad, Dr. Julie Ponesse, and Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, just to name a few, whose sole sin has been to expose the ideological biases prevalent in the academy, particularly in the humanities today. Which is why it's foolish for conservatives and libertarians to attack radical policies, since radicals are constantly inventing new ones based upon Marxist fantasies. Rather, I prefer to go straight to the ideology which possesses them. And believe me, they are possessed by idea pathogens. Their adherence to mere dogma has become a replacement for religion. A religion which has no factual basis and no historical validity. They're the reincarnation of Eric Clapton's blind faith, playing through Marshall stacks dialed up to 12 to drown out their cognitive dissonance. RA, postmodernism, cultural Marxism, and the humanities. I am astounded that most parents are unaware that our universities are teaching our children not to become individuals. That they are telling our children that they are not an autonomous being capable of individual thought and action, but rather merely are an extension of the collective. I'm also appalled that anyone who listens to their professor's Neo-Marxist drivel wouldn't react violently against this attempt at indoctrination. The most important thing to me when I was young was to develop my own unique sense of self-identity. My parents and my teachers tried to force me into their own preconceived molds, yet I rebelled relentlessly. I never wanted to be anyone but me. What makes a human being think that they should surrender their own autonomy and individuality at the door of the lecture hall to be rendered into a flavorless soup? That and the fact that there's not a single politician talking about the toxic social collectivist ideology being taught in our universities at the taxpayers' expense. There's not been a moment spent on the floors of Parliament, provincially or federally, to discuss this hideous nonsense and the enormous expenditure of resources used to promulgate it. As I mentioned previously, I have subscribed to academia.edu, from whom I receive academic papers written on cultural Marxist theory. I don't open every one of the papers I receive from them in my inbox, but I do sample their content from time to time, so that I may speak intelligently about postmodern and neo-Marxist theory. Why would I, other than to inform myself to give the devil his due? So no, it's not a lot of work, as my friend John Rebello stated. Hi, John. Rather, it provokes rage in me. I rage against the darkness that is closing in on all of us. In particular, it's a hideous cultural assault that is coming for our children. It's so perverse and unnatural that I have no words to define how ugly it is. So the neo-Marxist cultural revolution proceeds unabated, despite all the evidence of the failures and tyranny of social collectivism. Yet the postmodernists are winning, even as society embraces this toxic ideology. Yet many still have the temerity to wonder why we are faced with social and economic ruin. Which leads me to this conclusion regarding the psychology of those who fall prey to these idea pathogens. We elect psychopaths to govern us. I can't believe how incredibly narcissistic one would need to be to believe that their knowledge of systems of infinite complexity are sufficient for them to make statements about wanting to change the world when they aren't even capable of changing themselves. With that, I'll have a sip of my cappuccino. The constant meddling and deconstructing of systems which took millennia to evolve are being torn down before our very eyes by fools whose sole achievement is deconstructing the very things which they ought to be building up, like our oil and gas sector, under proper parliamentary oversight, which will truly respond to the democratic will of the people. Pathological leaders are completely incapable of understanding the principles of democracy, as they see themselves as superior and life as a competitive battle where the most ruthless deserve to dominate others. And I'll make a little aside here, this is what is so hilarious about social collectivism, because the people that are most accountable for foisting it on us are themselves the ones that are the least willing to express themselves as a part of the collective. They invariably inject themselves as the leaders of the collective and therefore reap the greatest rewards. Once in power, they do their utmost to dismantle and discredit democratic institutions, including the freedom and legitimacy of the press, independent of state control. In other words, electing narcissists and psychopaths to public office is tantamount to national harikari, the ritualized act of self-annihilation, self-destruction, and suicide. It signals the demise of democracy and lays the foundations for a totalitarian regime that is legalistic, militaristic, inflexible, intolerant, and inhumane. The kind of individuals who want power the most ruthless and unempathetic, are the ones who shouldn't have power at all. All potential leaders and members of a government should be thoroughly examined and tested by psychologists to determine whether they have one or more personality disorders, thereby determining their fitness for power. I believe it was the elite's plan all along to create generations of humanoid automatons who have had the ability to question authority driven out of them to ensure their blind conformity to the dictates of the state. Every single hideous idea poisoning society today has originated from radical social collectivism in the academy. Every single policy which emanates from these postmodernists and cultural Marxists has resulted in them demanding that the executive branch of government be granted arbitrary powers to use force to promulgate their toxic ideology. And the way this was forced upon us began in the Germanic school system modeled by North American educators who took tiny tots away from their parents to turn them into wards of the state. K to 12 is where the social engineering begins, perhaps even in nursery school. It's time to deconstruct the toxic environments our children are forced into by returning our education system to the control of the parents and away from their ideologically possessed teachers, the teachers' unions, and big government. Since at present we are permitting our children's minds and hearts to be poisoned with toxic notions of gender fluidity and pernicious claims that our society is essentially a patriarchal tyranny. But be prepared for narcissistic rage as we tackle these most vital of all issues. When we hold a narcissist accountable for their own behavior, we must prepare for a flood of denial and projection. Invariably, this will result in the narcissist pinning the tail on the donkey who dared to point out how their behavior affects us and rage over the fact that we are refusing to provide them with further narcissistic supply sufficient to sustain their self-delusion. Our children have been under assault while we have slept blindly, trusting that those whom we have trusted and elected to care for them actually had their best interests at heart. Spoiler alert. Ideologically possessed narcissists are power mongers who need to have their narcissistic supply surgically removed. It will be insufficient merely to remove politicians and their bureaucratic minions from office, and it won't be enough to remove toxic Neo-Marxist professors from the academy. First and foremost, we must admit to ourselves that we have allowed this to happen. That we stood by and have done nothing while every sacred institution upon which our democracy rests was corrupted and contaminated by radical neo-Marxist ideology. We must not merely demand that our institutions be rid of this nefarious ideology. We must pray, since we need God to restore order to our broken land. And as the song says, let your justice roll like rivers deep. Let your mercy flow like healing streams. Let your righteousness pour from your throne. Let justice roll. Let justice roll. It brings life everlasting, gives beauty for our scars, replaces fear with courage, chases away the dark, transforming what was hopeless into victory. It makes the lame start dancing. It sets the prisoners free. Oh, hear them sing. Let justice roll. Let it roll through me. So I hope those are thought-provoking remarks. I hope you'll pray as I do, and that you will demand that your children be left alone and that their education be restored to our control. God bless you all. Have a great day.